Hi, Ash here. Today I've got a review of The 100 Rebellion for you, which is the fourth book in the 100 book series. I'd say a bit of previous knowledge about the 100 as a whole would be good to have as context, but you don't need to be an expert by any means to watch this. All quotes are read by the wonderful Eliška, who I'd like to thank for reading them. Now, on to the review. Upon being offered the 100 Rebellion to read while bored, my friend once said,
I'd rather stare at the wall the whole time than thanks.
which I think was an accurate assumption as to how enjoyable reading said book was. The first hint that the book wouldn't exactly be the best was the cover. It has a photo of the characters as portrayed by the TV show. There's nothing wrong with that on its own, except 2 of the 5 characters on the cover aren't in the book at all. I honestly have no idea why they couldn't have just used a different promotional picture featuring more of the characters from the books, or at least excluding those who didn't appear at all. Despite this, I read on, already having bought the box set. The book tells a story featuring the same set of characters as the first 3. Bellamy, Clark, Wells, and Glass, through whose POVs it's told, along with various other characters. Most of these were teenage delinquents sent to the Earth to test its survivability. There are also people who came down to Earth after the delinquents, as well as people who survived on Earth after the apocalypse. These groups are beginning to get on well and want to celebrate their newfound friendship. However, the celebration is attacked by what we later find out to be the cult of protectors, worshipping the earth and led by a woman named Soren. They plunder and take hostages to force them to turn into cult members. A cult setting is difficult to handle correctly for any author, and I don't think it was executed in the best possible way here. Now, I've never been in a cult myself, so I'll only cover the most glaringly obvious problems. First of all, kidnapping people is a really bad way to get people to join your cult. From what I've read, cults definitely try to seem appealing and friendly at first, only very slowly piling on the most manipulative things. Even immediately after getting kidnapped, the prisoners, or potential new protectors, whatever you want to call them, were barely watched and could discuss their plans for escape fairly easily. An effective cult would be more likely to separate prisoners who previously knew each other and make them feel like the only people they could rely on were members of the cult itself. Overall, the introduction into the cult happens far too fast, the plan being that the new recruits get forced into marriage in a weird, creepy pairing ceremony mere days after being kidnapped. The ceremony itself is a whole problem of its own. Not only are the allegedly brainwashed recruits not brainwashed at all, a gazebo made of human bones certainly doesn't help them feel at ease.
In the center of the orchard was a grotesque construction, a carefully erected gazebo made of bones, human bones, and on it stood the High Protector, looking beatific, like a priestess waiting to bless her flock.
I'm not saying people haven't built structures out of human bones before. I just think a literal bone gazebo, for no reason at all, is a bit much. Cass Morgan clearly doesn't believe any of her readers to be intelligent enough to recognize a cult, so she lays it on very thick, which is how the book ends up with sentences like,
Her sweet maternal nature hid the fact that she was brainwashing all her people.
which really takes a reader back to English teachers drilling show don't tell into their brain in elementary school. What I do know a lot about, unlike cults, are LGBTQ issues and representation. The most prominent example of this in the show is Clark and Lexa's relationship. Not only does Lexa not exist at all in the books, Clark shows no indication of being queer. Instead, the books choose to put her in a relationship with Bellamy, which has a whole other set of problems, but more on that later. Who is, however, canonically sapphic in the books, is Octavia.
So is something going on between you and that Walden girl? She pressed her lips together, but couldn't keep a smile from spreading across her face. Oh boy, Wells laughed. There are going to be a lot of heartbroken guys back at the camp. He paused thoughtfully. Girls, too.
I don't particularly mind the portrayal of this relationship. Sure, it can seem a bit random and underdeveloped, but so are many of the other relationships in the book series. What I don't understand is the erasure of Octavia's identity in the show. The show differs quite a bit from the source material, but Octavia's grounder lover, Lincoln, could just as easily have been a girl before Lexa was ever introduced to the plot. We can't touch on Clark and Lexa's relationship without speaking of the obvious bury your gays trope the showrunners pulled. It was one of the most famous examples of dead lesbian syndrome and disappointing to many fans. However, I'm not here to talk about the show, so let's move on to the other canonical queer relationship in the books, the one between Eric and Felix. Felix, in the show, is called Nathan Miller, which is an extremely random change to make, and I have no clue why it was made. Overall, they're side characters, they don't really matter, and while the pessimistic part of me feels like they're just token gays, the truth is the 100 is just extremely focused on having teenagers date each other in general. I wouldn't call it bad representation, but it's also not the best. As I mentioned, Clark does not date Lexa in the books. Instead, she pursues a romantic relationship with one of the other main characters, Bellamy. Throughout most of the books, it hadn't bothered me too much. It does take up more of the book than I'd prefer, and it is rather annoying when the situation is dire and Clark and Bellamy are just kissing or having a romantic moment for far too long. But I suppose that is just my personal preference. What I do consider more of an objective flaw is how the relationship turns oddly sour towards the very end of the book.
He felt his lips curl into a sneer. People die when you're trying to be rational, Clark. Like Lily. He knew the words were a step over the line the moment they came out of his mouth. She recoiled and gasped as if his words had knocked the air out of her. "Are you serious?" she said hoarsely. "I'm just saying that you might not be the best person to determine our course of action when there are lives on the line." Her head shot up, rage, hurt, pain shining from her eyes. Then, as Bellamy watched, his chest growing tight, she pulled it all back in, her face becoming as cold and remote as a statue. "And you are?" she snapped. "The last time you were involved in a hostage situation, your father was shot."
They have this argument, all the while still feeling like each of them cares for the other, and yet they utilize each other's worst trauma against each other. Now, I'm no dating expert, but that doesn't sound awfully romantic. I'd consider it a part of basic human decency to not use someone's trauma against them, especially if otherwise you reassure them that you know it's not their fault and that you don't blame them. Clark and Bellamy made up soon after this argument.
"I'm so sorry," she said softly. "I can't believe I let Paul do that to you. I'll never forgive myself." Bellamy didn't respond, but he didn't loosen his grip around her either. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet and measured. "I know you won't. That's why I'm sorry about the terrible things I said. You carry so much pain with you, Clark, and I used that against you. I knew how to hurt you, and I went for it. Can you forgive me?" She knew he was right, but hearing the tenderness in his voice was enough to make that weight disappear, if only for a moment. "Yes, if you can forgive me."
The apology seems nice enough. I don't have too much of an issue with it. I do believe they forgave rather easily, but that can just be a personal thing for the characters. Their thinking also would have been affected by the omnipresence of death around them. What I really disliked was how far after this argument they got engaged. This seemed purely there to provide an ending to the book. It seemed to me that the author was simply stuck on making a satisfying ending and...
"Clark, will you marry me?" Her knees gave out. She put her hands on his shoulders and let herself slide to the ground beside him. Her arms slung around his shoulders, her kiss serving as the only answer he would ever need. But just in case, she drew away and murmured against his lips, "Yes."
Seemed like the easiest way out. To be clear, I'm not saying Clark and Bellamy's relationship is unrealistic. I mean, I've known people who got engaged just as fast and promptly broke up. I simply don't see what Bellamy and Clark have to be healthy. Of course, media portraying unhealthy relationship is in no way inherently a bad thing, but in The 100, the romance is very idealized and portrayed as desirable, which I do see as a problem. Overall, The 100 books are a prime example of the post-Hunger Games obsession with teen dystopia. I've genuinely enjoyed some books to come out of this era, like Divergent, which definitely can't be considered the height of literature, but was a fun read. I read The 100 mostly due to the fact I really liked the series, but was disappointed. It did, however, read fast, which was one of its only advantages in my opinion. As a whole, the plot doesn't really hold up in comparison to the series. There's far too much focus on the romantic dramas of teenagers for my taste. The characters also monologue at inappropriate times, which is rather a pet peeve of mine. Most of my issues with this book, and the series as a whole, are matters of personal opinion, but there are some objective flaws, which I really hope I've covered extensively in this review. And that's all. I'd like to thank you all for watching. Check out my social medias and let me know if you'd like me to do more reviews. I've also linked the original essay that this was basically a reading of in the description, so you can check that out if you want. Bye!